You just got a complaint. Now what? In this episode, we break down the critical first 24 hours of an investigation and how your actions can make or break credibility. You don't want to miss this one.
Welcome to the HR Investigations Podcast, exploring the issues, challenges, strategies, and solutions. Sponsored by RPCHR and hosted by Natalie Ivy, an HR consultant, licensed PI, and author of the best-selling book, How to Conduct Internal Investigations, a practical guide for human resource professionals. And now, here's Natalie.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to the HR Investigations Podcast. I'm Natalie Ivy, your host, and this is the podcast where we talk about real-world challenges in HR and employee relations, and we just talk some shop about handling complaints and investigations. So if you work in HR, you already know this kind of moment. Let me explain. You receive an email, or you get a Teams message, or an employee walks into your office via your open door process and says, I need to talk with you about something. And really what they're making is a report. And you know, instantly in that moment, your day just changed, didn't it? Our episode today is focusing on what I call the most critical window in any investigation, which is the first 24 hours. And the reason for that is, well, really what you do at the beginning really can determine whether an investigation is going to be credible, defensible, fair, legally sound, or whether it's going to turn into confusion, bias, and documentation problems later. Now, most investigations that happen are not really going to start out with some kind of a formal complaint form. It's usually a lot less structured. It's generally going to be an emotional employee, a hallway conversation, maybe an email that has some vague allegations in it, or you might even have a manager say, hey, you might want to take a look at this. Well, this moment is intake, and this is where HR professionals really need to shift into that neutral, fact-finding mode. And one of the biggest mistakes that I see from my vantage point is when HR immediately begins doing their own kind of analysis and they're judging the person's credibility, or they even make the big blunder of even promising some specific outcomes. You definitely don't want to do that. Instead, the goal at intake is simple. Capture information accurately and neutrally. And that means you have to ask questions like, what happened? Who was involved? When did this occur? Were there any witnesses? And if so, who were they? What are their position titles? What location do they work at? Has this happened before? You notice what's missing, though? You're not asking, why do you think they did that? Or do you think this was discrimination? Or do you think that this was harassment? Okay, remember, your job at intake is fact-finding. You're not really shifting into any kind of a legal analysis. Another common mistake that I see HR professionals make, and often unintentionally, is appearing to take sides far too early. And this can happen through just simple comments like, well, I'm sure there's some sort of an explanation. Or, wow, that doesn't really sound like something she would do, he would do. All right, even these statements that are kind of meant to kind of reassure an employee, that already is just signaling bias. And from where the employee is sitting, it kind of looks like you really are picking sides and are not going to be happy about it. The truth is, at the beginning of an investigation, you don't know what happened yet. And that's why a well-run investigation is necessary, and it requires really complete procedural neutrality. And that means, of course, you need to take the complaint seriously. Now, I hear everybody in HR says that. We take complaints very seriously. I hear it over and over and over again. All right, but you really need to mean it. And, you just don't assume that when a person is delivering the complaint to you, whatever method they use, whether it's Teams or open door, okay, just don't jump to the conclusion that you're hearing from somebody who's really acting in good faith. Sometimes people make bad faith complaints, so don't jump to the assumption that what they're telling you is true about whatever their allegations are against the subject. And also, that means you need to document the allegations very carefully and explain the process very clearly. And you might say something like, I really appreciate you bringing this issue to me and bringing it forward. I'm going to document what you've shared with me and review it to determine some appropriate next steps. Notice the difference in that kind of statement instead of, oh man, this must really be something that is just like driving you crazy. I can imagine. Yeah, I used to work for so-and-so and I know how she can be. You see what the difference is? The thank you for bringing this to me and I'm going to document and review it to determine next steps is keeping neutrality. The latter phrase that I used was like, you're kind of chiming in with the person. And in some cases, this is what HR professionals want to do too. They want to be perceived as I'm your friend, I'm your buddy, I'm your advocate. And you have to be very, very careful of shifting into that position here. So you've got to stay neutral. So the statement that is a little more neutral, it validates the employee, but it avoids making promises. And that's the zone that you need to stay in. Now, also, documentation the first 24 hours, this is also where I see some organizations struggle. Instead of using a centralized system, documentation ends up scattered across various email threads, Word document here and there, a spreadsheet here and there, sticky notes, okay, all over the place, and then maybe somebody's folder that's labeled like investigation stuff. The problem is that investigations are actually legal records. And if you ever have litigation, and sometimes it happens, look, it's a numbers game. There's a certain number of cases you're going to work that are going to wind up in court. So they could be reviewed by attorneys, could be regulators, depending on the situation, like somebody from Wage and Hour at the DOL, EEOC, courts, or even various government agencies. Your documentation really needs to capture the allegation, the date it was reported, who reported it, who received the report, and then the initial steps taken. And ideally, you need to have it in a central repository. Now, I've been on, my show for years talking about documentation and the need for having some centralized place where you are housing all of your stuff. Now, there are plenty of really great case solutions out there. And if you're interested in learning more about that, you can certainly look back on some of my previous episodes. I've had executives on from not only HR Acuity, but also from Case IQ. Those are two of the biggies. They are not the only ones in town, but I'm here to tell you that you got to do some research into getting something better, because this documentation process, especially in this first 24 hours, is critical. And also, it's about business continuity. What if you might wind up getting your dream job and you move away from this current organization, or you wind up getting promoted? Well, what about your successor? Do they want to look for an email thread here, Word document there, spreadsheet here, and sticky notes over here? Not a good process at all. And it's certainly not going to be the finest hour for the business from a legal standpoint if you do wind up in litigation, because stuff is going to get lost. All right, now determining the next steps. Look, not every complaint is going to require a full investigation. I was just recently delivering a talk on exactly this topic for Case IQ, by the way, and I had almost 800 people who were on that webinar. And obviously, this is a thing. A lot of people really don't understand when an investigation is really needed and when it's not. Look, some scenarios with employees are really going to require coaching, guidance, some mentorship, conflict resolution. But nevertheless, even if you offer the coaching, guidance, mentorship, conflict resolution, mediation, and you're going to work collaboratively with leaders, perhaps in their respective department, to work through it, you still have to make sure that you're documenting. And you can't just say, oh, well, I just spent 45 minutes coaching this employee. But it wasn't an investigation, so I don't really need to make any note of it. Ooh, wrong answer. You really do. You don't know where this issue could go in a few weeks or months from now. And again, also business continuity. You don't know in a few months, you could maybe move over to a lateral role in a different part of your organization. You need to give your successor the benefits of your notes and what type of coaching, conflict resolution, mentorship, mediation did you do? And then it also is sometimes that initial intake, that is the spark for sometimes some more serious investigations later. Sometimes employees are not necessarily always forthcoming with all of the backstory. So at least if you have documented what it is that you learned were their issues and then you preserved it, if later they try to say that, well, they really came forward and told you about X, but you've documented that it was about Y, that's the kind of stuff that can protect you. All right, so questions that you need to consider when you are doing the intake. Does the allegation involve any policy violations? Does it involve harassment, discrimination, retaliation, or any kind of misconduct that could violate one of your policies? Is there any risk to employees or the organization? Well, if you answer to any one of these as yes, an organization is usually appropriate. And to summarize, I call it my 3 key word principle: policy, procedure, or law. Is what the complainant alleging at intake, are they telling you something that could possibly violate one of your organization's policies, such as, let's say, your EEO policy? Or are they sharing with you something like, maybe someone in accounting is not really following the GAAP, like generally accepted accounting principles. Maybe somebody is keeping a separate set of books, or there's an allegation somebody's maybe cooking the books. Okay, that's a whole other thing, right? But some of you may even have regulatory procedures, and if those aren't followed, that can be bad, right? So you need to make sure that you're listening intently at intake, and if it could potentially implicate policy, procedure, or something legally, then you err on the side of caution and you open up a case. All right, so in today's episode, to kind of recap here, we talked about the first 24 hours of an investigation, and that means conducting a neutral intake interview. It means you have to really avoid the bias, and you also have to really watch your mouth kind of engaging before the brain does and just beginning to kind of side with an employee. And that's also bias. If maybe the employee is making some allegations against a manager with whom maybe you've locked horns a few times, you might find yourself slipping a little bit and making even some comments about some of your own experiences with said manager, and you're already biased. And that's the kind of stuff that could come out later. We also talked about documenting complaints properly and having a central place to do that. So whatever solution you currently have, I would ask you to really evaluate. Is it working for us? Or is it a bit of a haphazard type of process where it's not really a central repository where you're keeping all of your information? And then also deciding the appropriate next steps. You've got to really think about the approach. Is this something I'm going to open up a formal case? And if so, then who do I need to involve? Usually legal. Okay. The other thing is, if it's more of a coaching, counseling, mentoring, or mediation, okay, what should be the appropriate next steps? Am I really the right one to facilitate the mediation? Perhaps not. It may be that it's the leader who is over, let's say it's the accounting department, who should be responsible for leading the conflict that maybe has emerged between two employees, right? But you have to be thinking about what are those appropriate next steps, and also not being specific in committing to it at this juncture. You need time to really analyze what it is that you learned during that intake conversation. Now, in the next episode, we're going to talk about something every HR professional has experienced when complaints are filed immediately after a performance conversation, right? So we're going to then really talk about is it a legitimate complaint? Is it something else? And was it really an accountability discussion around the employee's performance? Or is it maybe a manager is playing some games and we might even have a whopper of a retaliation claim? So we're going to get into that in my next episode. Now, the last thing I want to leave you with is this. If you want to take your HR investigation skill set to the next level, I do have my 2-day virtual workshop coming up. It is on April 8th and 9th from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, virtual via Zoom with me facilitating it. And this is a certification workshop, so you'll earn 10 SHRM PDCs and or 10 HRCI credits. You'll also get a digital certified HR investigator badge that you can use for your socials. You'll get a free copy of my book, How to Conduct Internal Investigations, a practical guide for HR professionals. And that comes complete with a supplemental toolkit. It's got sample policies, forms, quizzes, and you also will walk away with an RPC HR swag bag. Now, in the show notes for today's show, you will find the registration link, And the early bird registration is going to be wrapping up fairly soon. And also, we do close out the registration when we hit our maximum head count. And I always limit the number of folks in my programs. So if you are needing some of your professional development and you're needing some credits, this would be a great opportunity. And I'd love to see you there. And now, gang, always remember, the best investigation is the one you don't have to do. See ya.
Thanks for joining us today on the HR Investigations Podcast. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share the show with any colleagues who will benefit from our strategies and solutions. For free bonus resources, simply visit hr-investigations.com. And remember, if you'd like some help with improving your investigative skills, or if your organization is in need of an external investigator to help with the case, please get in touch with us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.